Welcome to the Ignorance is Strength podcast. I'm your host, Fabian motherfucking Ojeda, and I don't know shit, but that's okay. All right, let's get this shit started. Thank you, everybody, for listening to the Ignorance is Strength podcast. Thank everybody for staying around. I know we haven't had consistent episodes in quite a while, so I'm glad to be back. Sometimes, life gets in the way. Definitely, that was the case for me. And we'll talk about it in a future episode, but was hospitalized for a bit. So I'm glad to be back. And I'm back with a very interesting guest. I want to welcome to the podcast for the very first time. He's an author, a legal expert, and an elite college insider, Mr. Sahaj Sharda. How you doing?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me on. I'm really excited for this conversation.
Yeah, same here. Where are you joining us from today, Sahaj?
So I'm actually joining you from my dorm room at Columbia University, where I'm a law student.
That's interesting that you're in a dorm room because we're going to talk education right now. I'm like, that's a little bit ironic. Right. So
exactly.
I know you have a lot of education, right? So tell us a little bit about yourself. I know you kind of had some humble beginnings, right? And you worked yourself up to pretty much, what few people are able to do.
So I grew up in a middle-class family in the suburbs of Washington, D.C. And education was always something that was really stressed in my family. It was always super important to take your work seriously. And so I was always steeped in those values. And so, it was never really a question on to whether or not I would go to college. I mean, that was sort of like the norm in my family. My grandfather, who was born in India, used to study by like candlelight, was the first in his family to go to college. And he ended up getting a PhD. And so he's probably one of the people who's foundational in creating that culture in my family. But it's something I always grew up in, I was steeped in. And so, education was almost seen as like sort of the silver bullet in my family. These are the values I grew up with. Like, this is like the most important thing. These are the things that are going to change the world. And, I think like that idealism that I grew up with about education really hit the road when I started going to more and more prestigious schools and universities because the reality really started to, cause a lot of cognitive dissonance with the ideas I grew up with regards to what education really should be, how it should help people move up in life, how it should be upwardsly mobile. Instead, at a lot of the institutions I went to, it was the exact opposite. It was exclusive. It was about keeping the same people from the same families who were already entrenched in positions of power and basically excluding anyone who wanted to move up. It was an education for people who were already made and not for people on the make. And so that was something that I found very disheartening.
Yeah. And, this is it's kind of a historic thing. I think when universities were first, opened, right, it really was only for the elite. It was for the people who could afford it. Right. And now we have these public universities and everything. And you would think that it's more for the common folk, right? But it's getting harder and harder for the common folk to really, get a college education, right?
Right. So, the area that I really focused on in my book, that I think we're going to be talking about a little bit later, but just to like sort of give you a frame on how I started to think about these issues. So when I was growing up, I was in high school when I encountered my first college admission scandal. And sadly, this became a much more common theme throughout my life. But in high school, there was a girl who was a year older than me. Her name was Sarah Kim. And she told everyone that she had gotten into both Harvard and Stanford, and that both of these schools were going to create a special program just for her, where she could do 2 years at each. And as you can imagine, some kids called bullshit. Other people started asking about, was this story true? Was it not true? What we didn't know at the time was that, this rumor, this like silly thing had made its way all the way to the South Korean press. Her family was from South Korea. And the South Korean press had dispatched reporters to come cover this story at this high school in the suburbs of Virginia. And, one day I'm walking into school and there's all these news crews outside the school, and they're asking students like me, do we know the quote genius girl? These are all South Korean news crews. They're beaming all of this back all the way to South Korea. And, as more and more people started to pay attention to this story, it started to unravel more and more. Finally, maybe 1 or 2 weeks later, everyone in the school, or a lot of students in the school, got an email from what was nominally considered to be a math professor at Harvard. And the email was really weird. It read something like, hey, people at Harvard have been hearing about these rumors at your high school. We just want you to stop. Sarah Kim is a very gifted student. Now, it's not clear why a Harvard professor would go out of his way to address gossip at a random high school.
Yeah, that's super weird.
What we found out later was that email was also forged. And really what had happened was this girl had gotten caught so deep in this web of lies, probably something that began with a little bit of insecurity, had just blown up in all of these ways that she just had to keep lying to sort of like avoid the next shoe dropping. And it became this bigger and bigger thing. It became this massive scandal. It got covered in CNN, in the Washington Post, and obviously it was being covered very severely internationally. Her parents had to go in the press and apologize for how they raised their daughter. That experience, just watching that happen from afar, it would be easy, and many people did this, to criticize her as like a liar or someone who was, morally deranged. But I would always flip it and ask questions about, what does it say about our society where very smart people feel so pressured that it's better to lie than to accept that you didn't get into an elite college? And what does it say about our system where there's so much pressure so early to be recognized as one of the chosen few? And I think all of these are really dangerous things that we've allowed to happen. I mean, we're toxically allocating self-esteem to some of the brightest students in America through this really flawed, weird pressure cooker system. And I think the question we have to start asking is why? Who benefits when we do that?
Yeah, and I work with kids. I've worked with a lot of high school kids, right? And there is a pressure, right? There's a huge pressure. They right from the time right from the time they get into first grade, kindergarten, they're told go to college, go to college, go to college, go to college, right? Even the ones who maybe they're not best suited for it. Maybe they should pick up a trade somewhere, right? Maybe they should go to the military. They're discouraged from all those things. It's like it's all about the college going experience. I myself, I grew up a poor kid, and I'm like, I didn't really put much emphasis on college. I did eventually graduate, but I went to a private school, but now I'm in so much debt, and you talk about, in your book, right, how colleges are kind of like a cartel. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So I think this is the main thrust of my book. 2 years ago, I started with the simple question, why does college cost so much? And as I studied that question more and more, I kept arriving at this weird area, which is, why do elite colleges cost so much? And, as I started really thinking about that sub-question, I arrived at an even deeper insight, which is, if elite colleges are so good at teaching, if it's so lucrative for them to teach, why don't they want more campuses, right? Like, why doesn't Harvard franchise? I mean, if you have $50 billion in a bank and you're like a widget company, you'd build more factories to build more widgets. But at all of these elite schools, the logic is precisely the opposite. And I understand, right? The schools have to be somewhat selective, but that doesn't explain why Harvard doesn't want to steal all of Princeton's students and all of Yale's students. It almost seems like even amongst their bracket, they don't really compete. And so the only way to understand this kind of, sort of anti-competitive behavior is to understand that the elite colleges are a cartel. They've created this weird structure where none of them are trying to expand seats, expand slots, so that they don't really have to compete with each other for, qualified, talented students. The simple fact of the matter is, if everyone at Princeton, everyone at Harvard just switched places next year, neither school would really notice. I mean, the classes are virtually indistinguishable from a statistics point of view, from a demographic point of view, where the students come from. And so the question really becomes, well, why do we have this system where the schools are not competing? Why do we have such an anti-competitive system? And the answer is, the colleges collude. They collude in all sorts of ways. Yale, Georgetown, Columbia, Duke, and a bunch of others, for example, collude on price fixing. They have this group called the 568 Presidents Group, which is a legitimate price fixing cartel. They get together once or twice a year, and they come up with a common formula for how to assess applicants' financial aid needs. Now, in any other circumstance, if all the competitors got together and decided on how to price their product together, it would be the biggest violation of the antitrust laws. Yet somehow in this context, Congress has written the schools an exemption, right? And so when you, in area after area, so price fixing on seat scarcity. So on seat scarcity, what do the schools do? All of the schools work with the U.S. News and World Report to give them specialized access to data, to information, to surveys, so that U.S. News and World Report can maintain a monopoly in the college rankings market. And then what happens is the U.S. News and World Report's criteria incentivizes schools to reject as many students as possible and to spend as much money as possible per student. So you have this weird relationship where the schools are empowering the rankings and the rankings is empowering the schools by creating this scarce system, this system-wide scarcity, by incentivizing each school, if they want to climb up in the rankings, to accept less and less students. And so it's sort of like, a hub and spoke cartel where you have the rankings coordinating all of these schools' behavior to make them more and more indistinguishable from each other, more and more expensive, fewer and fewer students, more international students, more people with wealthy backgrounds, and fewer people who are trying to move up in the world, fewer ambitious American students who can get into these schools. And so in area after area, on seats, on endowment taxes, on price fixing, on subsidies, on all of these areas, the schools come together. They don't compete, they collude. And the only way to understand that is as a cartel. Now, the big issue is if it was just the elite colleges, maybe it wouldn't be such a big problem. But when the elite colleges do this type of collusion, it trickles down into all the other schools in America, right? So when they work with the rankings to create a criteria that incentivizes selectivity and spending as much as possible, well, then those incentives get transferred onto UVA and Virginia Tech and JMU and all the way up and down the college ecosystem, so that everyone now is trying to spend more and accept less. Everyone now is doing these inefficient things that might make sense for Harvard to do, but certainly make no sense at Hartford. And when you're seeing this type of weird, toxic behavior, is it any surprise then when you get a Varsity Blues or Sarah Kim or this other story, which was there was a girl in 2007 named Azia Kim who went to
another Kim?
Yeah, well, this one's really crazy. She went to Stanford for 9 months, was taking tests there, was impressing her students. Everyone thought she was really smart. All of a sudden, 9 months in, Stanford came and they kicked her off campus. And the reason they kicked her off campus is because she was never a student to begin with. She'd been climbing in and out through the buildings, through open windows. She was staying in an empty dorm room. And this whole time she was pretending to be a student at the school. And the question you have to ask is, I mean, is Stanford really so good that you'd rather pretend to be a student than not be a student at all? Right? I mean, she must have known that the jig was going to be up sooner rather than later. Why would you do that? And the answer is there's so much scarcity. There's so much toxicity. This artificial scarcity has created such a weird pressure cooker environment that it's screwing our students at every level. It's even screwing students who are not going to the elite colleges because it's warped those colleges' incentives. And this is like a massive problem that no one really talks about. No one talks about applying antitrust to the schools. No one talks about breaking up the college cartel. And I think it's a very important discussion because just as we broke up Standard Oil or AT&T or any of the other monopolies that were hurting America, I think the college cartel is certainly one that needs to be looked at very seriously, where antitrust probably should be applied.
Yeah, this reminds me of, I don't know if you watched a lot of TV back in the day, but the King of the Hill, the cartoon,
right,
where they have all the propane guys, they all start to collude together, and then they start fixing the price of propane, right?
Yeah.
You're right. That's not allowed anywhere else. You won't see all the car manufacturers get together and start price fixing, that shit will be busted right away, right?
Right.
And so somehow, yeah, it's allowed with the colleges, and what what's the answer there? What do we do? How do we fix that problem?
Yeah, so look, I think some of it is cultural. I think the colleges, an earlier era were more charitable. They were really were more like charities and less like businesses. And I think we've like held over our image of the colleges as still being like that. But I don't think today it's really reasonable to think of Harvard or Yale or Columbia or Georgetown as a charity. I think the only way to think of them is collectively as a cartel. It's the only correct frame. I mean, you can't explain some of these decisions that they make apart from that frame. And so I think the first step we have to do is reframe the schools from this point of view. And then the second thing I think we need to do is take a really deep, hard look at who's really benefiting from this type of artificial scarcity. Because the truth is, it's not smart girls like Azia Kim or Sarah Kim. It's not even rich people. When I was at Georgetown, there was the varsity blues scandal broke out on campus. And in that scandal, basically, there were people who were using athletic coaches at various schools to pretend like they were world-class athletes so that they could get into these colleges. And their parents were basically bribing these athletic coaches. And so there was a girl at Georgetown who was pretending to be a tennis star. Her parents paid out bribes to the tennis coach there, a man named Gordon Ernst. And essentially, it turned out she'd never played tennis competitively in her life. The FBI busted the whole ring. A lot of parents went to jail. And so even in that anecdote, you can see that it's not even like rich people really benefiting, right? I mean, what did they really get for that bribe? They would have been better off putting that money in an index fund and just giving it to their daughter. But it's about status. It's about these weird ways in which our society is being warped when there's such a scarcity of something that should be very abundant. Education should be the most abundant thing in the world. It shouldn't be treated like diamonds or like Louis Vuitton or like Gucci. It should be treated like water or food or housing. I mean, I think it's a fundamental issue that we're allocating, this most essential product, this most essential thing for human life in such a weird, toxic way. And so I would say the only people benefiting from that are the schools themselves. It's time for that cartel. I think way past time for that to be broken up.
Do you think, this is you mentioned it's affecting, the colleges that aren't even like the Ivy Leagues and things like that. They're not these, these top-notch schools. It's affecting the local schools as well.
Right.
I mean, weird question, but do you think this is going to affect like even the community colleges, the junior colleges at all?
Yeah, look, I mean, every time it's sort of like a trickle-down effect, right? Every time it affects one school below on the rung, it affects everyone else. So I'll give you an example. Yesterday, I was meeting up with a friend. He went to the University of Illinois, which is a great school. It's a public college in Illinois. And he was telling me that he was looking at the numbers the other day, and apparently the number of foreign students at the University of Illinois has skyrocketed in the last couple decades. And so the question is why? Why are there so many more foreign students today than there were 20, 30 years ago? And his like intuition was, it's because the University of Illinois is regulated by the Illinois legislature on how much they can charge in-state students, but it's not on how much they can charge out-of-state students. And so what they want to do is, because they're getting more and more greedy for money, right? Because again, they're being affected by these incentives in how the rankings have been shaped by the elite schools, that they need more and more money to climb the rankings that the elite school is basically rigged to benefit them. And so what they've done is they basically pushed out, in-state students in favor of people from China or people from Europe, rich kid loafers who want to come to America for like a really fun 4 years. And look, that's fine. I don't begrudge anyone wanting to come to this country and have a good time. But, when we're talking about our flagship public schools, I mean, these are supposed to be the engines of upwards mobility. And so if these schools are pushing out ambitious in-state students, people whose parents have paid taxes their whole lives, to uplift and support these institutions. I mean, we have to start asking some really tough questions about how we've structured the whole system. So to your point about community colleges, right? Like, if the schools like one level up from community colleges are becoming, sort of more and more rejective, more and more expensive, I think it does affect community colleges, because now there's less competition for community colleges, and therefore there's less reason for them to be as cost effective as possible. And maybe the impact is smaller there than it would be at other parts of the supply chain, but I think there probably is still an impact there.
Yeah, I think it's all over the place right now. It's in California, it's super hard to not super hard. I mean, it's super packed in like every school, at every
Right.
level. You mentioned, this, we do pay taxes, right? When we pay taxes, we expect, that we get some sort of service out of it, right? And we get something out of it. And we're not really getting that with the universities, colleges, and whatnot, right? So this is kind of a, it's I would say maybe kind of unrelated question, but it's related, right? You see these days, with the Biden administration and everything, people are getting their some of their debt wiped out, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, do you feel that's kind of like a fair thing? Some people are really against it, right? I mean, the people who never went to college, right? The people who paid off their loans already, and they're really upset about that. Not to get too political, right? But just I want to see if you had any quick thoughts on that, like as far as people getting their loans forgiven, right? And is it fair, given the situation that we're in, with people feeling this intense feeling like I have to go to college, I felt that that pressure, because it's like, oh, you need your degree in order to make more money at work, I didn't want to go. I didn't want to go to college. I didn't want to spend all that money, but I did, and I don't really think that piece of paper did much for me. I hate to be a pessimist there, but yeah. What do you think about that? The student loan forgiveness.
Yeah. So look, I think it's a really interesting thing, and the reason I think it's so interesting is because on the one hand, the student loan forgiveness is like framed as sort of like relief for students who've taken on a bunch of debt. But on the other hand, I think, it might also correctly be framed as a bailout for the schools that failed the students. Because what we're really saying is, if students have taken on debt that they can't pay back, it's because the education they got wasn't as valuable as the schools told them it was going to be. So who's really at fault? It's not the students, it's the schools. The schools who lied to students about how valuable these degrees were going to be, and then didn't deliver. And again, I would say that until you tackle what is wrong at the schools, until you make them way more cost effective, lean them out, and really force them to teach things that are valuable by breaking up some of this cartel structure, stripping them of all these tax exemptions, making sure that they just can't spend like drunken sailors. Until you do that, you're going to have this bloat, and the debt problem is going to come back, right? I mean, all of the things that Biden sort of wiped away are all retrospective, but they're not future looking. So in another 10 years, there's going to be another debt crisis unless the schools change. And so, I think it's great that a lot of students got relief, but unless we fix this problem now, we're going to have the exact same problem a decade from now, 2 decades from now, 3 decades from now. And this is why I couldn't be, more energetic about this really urgent and pressing problem. We can't let this happen again. And unfortunately, it seems to me like, apart from the debt cancellation, which is a bailout for the schools, very little has been doing to actually reform the schools themselves. And that, to me, that's a massive concern.
Yeah, and you know what? The one of the biggest problems too is that tuition keeps going up. Right, tuition keeps going up. I remember I was at a private university, but I mean the trend's happening everywhere where the tuition's going up, and I'm like, how much is one unit? And it used to be far less, and it was going from like 600 something to like almost 700. I think there might be at 800. Right, I'm like, for one unit, and every class is what, 3-4 units. That's bullshit, man. And the thing too is that in my opinion, you have to take all these useless classes, right, to fulfill your major. I'm a liberal arts major. I didn't learn a goddamn thing that's going to help me in the, in the real world, right? In again, just my opinion, but I mean, you're required to take all these classes, and they keep you there longer, and they just drain you of more money, right? Because tuition keeps going up. That's a problem, right? You can freeze tuition, but I don't think it's ever like gone down, right? Historically,
right. So it's funny in the 1980s, President Reagan had a Secretary of Education who wrote an op-ed in the New York Times, and it was titled something like "Our Greedy Colleges." And basically, this is in the 1980s. He was making the argument that because there's been such an expansion of student loans, because now anyone can take credit, schools are basically just charging more and more. So instead of making college more affordable, his argument was, the more government tried to help students, the more expensive it made college for the next generation of students. His argument was basically a lot of this inflation in tuition is because of how easily available credit is, and that type of thing. I don't know if I believe that entirely, but I think it's certainly true for some schools. I've seen some study that if you increase Pell Grants by $1, some schools capture up to 80 cents, which is higher tuition or less financial aid for that student. And so if a student only gets 20 cents of the government aid meant for him, who's benefiting most from that dollar? It's the school. It's the schools that are lobbying for these types of subsidies. It's the schools that are, asking governments to spend more and more. And so every time that, credit is expanded or the Pell Grants are expanded, and these are all things I think we should be doing, but unless you tackle how the schools do pricing, it will not matter. The schools are going to capture all of that extra help for themselves. And this, I think, explains a lot of why tuition rises year after year after year. Because it's not like the education's getting much better year after year after year. It's mostly staying the same. I think in some instances it's gotten worse. And so the question is, well, what the hell is getting so expensive that they have to keep charging more for? It's not like they pay their teachers that much more, right? It's just that they can. And they can because there's just more free money in the system. And, they know how to extract it and you don't.
Yeah. So I do want to mention your book, right? So give us a rundown. It's called The College Cartel, right?
Right.
Just give us an overview. I think we've been talking about it, so I mean, we've kind of gotten a little preview of it. So tell us about it, and is it where is it available, and all the details.
Yeah, great. So just to tell you a little bit about the arguments in the book, the book really details how elite colleges have come together and colluded on issue after issue after issue to benefit themselves and basically screw everyone else. And so the specific areas I talk about is how they've created a system-wide artificial scarcity in new seats, how they fix prices, how they cannibalize subsidies and then lobby for more subsidies so that they can cannibalize even more, and how they've avoided scrutiny. And so, I really conclude the book with a really strong argument for how we can fix some of these things, how we can make pricing way more transparent, how we can ban price fixing, how we can increase the expansion of seats, how we can break up some of these endowments to break the political power that the schools have, and really just applying this sort of like antitrust framework. What would Teddy Roosevelt do to these colleges, right? What would Woodrow Wilson do to these colleges? What would Thurman Arnold do to these colleges? And really bringing that kind of mindset back, because I think in too many instances, antitrust has been way less vigorous than it would have been a generation, 2, 3 generations ago. And I think it's way beyond time that we start thinking in that way again when we're confronted with monopolies and cartels. And so that's, basically the arguments in the book. The book is coming out this winter. It's going to be on Amazon. Again, it's called The College Cartel. But if you want to, really express, how much you support these ideas, you can go to www.breakthecartel.com. And right there, I have a petition asking Congress to make price fixing by elite colleges illegal again. And so, I think that's a very quick way for you to support this movement, you being the listener, And I think it's a really important thing, because unless there's, some indication to Congress that people are paying attention on these issues, the lobbyists are going to win. All of these Congress people went to the elite colleges. When the president of Harvard goes to the Hill, he gets a meeting with Schumer like that. Unless people feel like there's pressure to not give in to the schools, they're going to continue to rob the country. And I think it's more important than ever that people start paying attention to these issues. So those are the things I would really encourage people to start looking into. And please, if possible, sign this petition, tweet about it, make some noise about it. I think that's the only way we can fight back.
I like that you mentioned Teddy Roosevelt. What would he do? I think he'd ride in on a horse, shirtless, go in there and slap somebody and make things happen, right? So
that's right.
Let's really have a Teddy Roosevelt mindset about this, because
right.
if you don't make noise, nobody hears you, right? And right. So let's go ahead and get that petition signed, right? Everybody listening, I think if you get that petition signed, the people will start paying attention. So Sahaj, real quick, where can people find you online? I know you're getting your social media together. So where can people find you right now?
Yeah, so look, you can find me on Twitter at Sahaj Sharda. And obviously I'm going to give you that handle, and you can tag in some of your stuff. And then you can also find me on Substack, where I've been writing a blog. It's called The Muckrake by Sahaj Sharda. Again, happy to give you that link, and you can link to it. And so those are the two main areas you can find me. But obviously, if you want to go ahead and shoot me a DM on Twitter, I'm super happy to engage with anyone who has thoughts on any of these ideas, has any questions. Please go ahead and find me there.
All right, Sahaj, I really enjoyed our conversation. I know we just kind of scratched the surface. Is there anything else you want to throw out there to the podcast world before we go?
Yeah, I mean, look, the only thing I would say is, when it comes to a lot of these issues, I think people feel like they don't have that much agency. One person can't make that big a difference. I think when it comes to the beginnings of movements like this, one person can have a massive difference, right? Just using the phrase "the College Cartel" changes the politics dramatically, because the more every time someone uses that, it's sort of like big tech, right? Before 2016, no one was saying that. Now, all of a sudden, it's baked into the political narrative. I think you can have a massive impact at this moment, at the beginnings of this movement, just by using that phrase, by getting that discourse out there. And I'd really encourage you to do that. All
right. So let's go ahead and again, when that book comes out, let's just buy it. Let's look at what he has to say. Think about what was said on this podcast. Let's make some noise. All right. Again, Sahaj, I want to thank you for being on. I appreciate it. And for everybody listening at home, I appreciate you. Thank you. Fuck you and good night.
All right. Thank you.
Subscribe to the Ignorance is Strength podcast on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and Google Podcasts. Like, follow, and share on Facebook and Instagram at Ignorance is Strength Podcast, and on Twitter at The Ignorance Pod.